Hello, this is Meet the Writers. I'm Georgina Godwin. My guest today is the winner of the 2024 Baillie Gifford Prize for Non-Fiction, and he becomes the first author to win the double, both this award and the Booker Prize for the novel The Narrow Road to the Deep North. He's also an ambassador for the Indigenous Literary Foundation, an Australian not-for-profit that works to address the educational disadvantages faced by Indigenous Australian children and young people by providing access to books and literacy programmes. He worked with Baz Luhrmann as a writer on the 2008 film Australia, and The Narrow Road to the Deep North is being adapted for television and is currently in production. Describing his winning book, Question 7, Isabel Hilton, who was chair of the judges at this year's Baillie Gifford Prize, said that it spoke to the judges for its outstanding literary qualities and its profound humanity. The writer Peter Carey says it may just be the most significant work of Australian art in the last 100 years. Richard Flanagan, welcome to Meet the Writers. This book, you put at one point, is a love letter to your parents. And I really wanted to go back into your history, into your family history, because it's deep and complicated and really influences everything that you do in this beautiful hybrid memoir. I wanted to start with your great-great-grandparents, the Flanagan that you describe, who was transported to Tasmania. Tell us about what you know about him.
Virtually all my ancestors, as much as we know, were convicts transported to Tasmania, mostly in the 1840s, mostly from Ireland during the famine. On my father's side, it was Thomas Flanagan, who's my great-great-grandfather. He was transported for the crime of stealing 7 pounds of cornmeal at the height of the famine to feed his family. On my mother's side, it was my great-great-grandfather, who my grandmother remembered vividly, was Edward Mad Ned Green, and he'd actually been a white boy. They were a sort of physical force revolutionaries on the west coast of Ireland, Gaelic speaking. They used to dress up in white blouses and whiten their faces and ride out of the night. And, they were committed to physical force to try and change the growing restrictive laws around the tenant farmers. So it was, there was at once growing up a great memory and also a great forgetting. And what was never spoken about was the convict past, convictism in Tasmania was really a slave system, except there was manumission of the slaves after a certain point, but the manumission was limited. You couldn't return to Europe, you had to stay in the colonies, nor could you expect to have full rights, and legislation of various types was brought in to sort of keep many of the restraints that applied to convicts. Whether these were applied to the freedoms of the convicts once they were emancipated. And my people became a sort of Irish Catholic peasantry. They went into the bush and there they lived and intermarried up really till my generation. And for them, I think this is a huge difference between Europe and certainly, my island of Tasmania and perhaps Australia, that in Europe, the country, the land, these things are associated and deeply burnt into the collective memory of Europeans as being about repression, feudalism, oppression, and the city was freedom. And that's very much reflected, particularly in Romantic art and then modernist art, where, increasingly the city and all things urban become celebrated as the true loci of art. But where I grew up, the city, the town was the state. It was the jailer and the jail. It was the hangman and the noose. The land was freedom. The country was freedom. The culture there was very influenced by its Indigenous past. And the other great crime that my island suffered, or the other great tragedy, along with this slave system, was when I say a slave system, it was quite closely modelled in many ways on the plantation system that the English had set up in the Caribbean. And, the early landowners were known as planters, and sometimes their farms were referred to as plantations. I mean, it was a very similar sort of thing. Even the boats the convicts came out on were repurposed slave boats that, once the slave trade was forbidden, turned to the convict trade. But the second great crime was the genocide. The Indigenous people of Tasmania who'd had an extraordinary civilisation on the island for 40,000 years. Within a few decades, they were reduced to a few hundred people, in the closest to a total extermination of a race that the world has ever witnessed. Out of these two crimes, really, come the world I grew up in, which, as I said earlier, was a world at once that had a particular and certain type of memory that was of certain individuals and certain things, but there had also been a century of forgetting, and no one had any black blood and no one had any convict blood. That there was a great shame and stigma about both things.
And both things, of course, were reflected in your own immediate family history. Tell us about Mate.
Mate was was our grandma. I mean, I'm one of six children. I mean, I'm the fifth of six children, and I grew up conscious that I was loved, but with that I wasn't very important, that I was part of this great big clan. So there were six of us kids. There was my grandmother, and sometimes, when one or another of my aunts fell ill, their kids would come and live with us. At one point, an aunt who had seven kids, she fell ill, and the seven children came to live with us. So there were 13 of us, and
you all got chicken pox.
We got chicken pox, yes. So my poor mother had to deal with that. But Mate was a woman of some pretensions and even more hat boxes. But in effect, her whole life had been shaped by the fact that she was the granddaughter of a convict. And she and 13 brothers and sisters had sought to constantly reinvent themselves. They sort of, they were, they'd recreated themselves as something they very much were not. But I loved her very dearly, and she loved me, and perhaps because I liked listening to her stories. And her stories were circular and strange, and you could constantly return to them and always find something more, like a seed from a pharaoh's tomb that you could plant many years later and it would bear strange and wondrous fruits that no one had ever seen.
Well, exactly like your own stories, really.
I guess that's true, because another theme of question 7 is the very nature of time itself. And I think, I remember when I came to study history in Britain, how history made such sense of Europe. It sort of fitted neatly like a well-cut coat. But history didn't fit neatly on the Tasmanian world or the Australian world. And there was a different sense of time there. And it was a sense of time being circular, not linear. And when you look at the novel grew out of a European conception of time. Things proceed generally in novels on a sort of railroad track of development of plot and character and so on. The aesthetics vary, but it obeys these rules of linear time. But my world time was always circular. Things that had happened long ago kept happening, and nothing in the past could be said not to be happening now or not to be happening in the future. And so that was the very strong sense I grew up with. And I was fascinated, not long before starting writing question 7, I was sent an essay, which was by an 18-year-old Yolngu girl. The Yolngu are Indigenous people in the far north of Australia, northeast Arnhem Land. And in that she talks about how the Yolngu, in their language, have 4 tenses, as they have past, present and future, as we have. And then they have a 4th tense, which is about which is about how things that are happening now are also simultaneously happening in the past and in the future. This idea of the fourth tense of things constantly recurring, of things at once happening with us at this moment, repeating things that happened long ago and foretelling things that will happen again, has struck me as being very true to reality. And they also impose a completely different concept of how you might relate to each other, how you might perceive yourself, and how you might relate to the earth itself, because it suggests a sense of both responsibility and continuity. And it also gives you at once a sense of humility, because you are not ever one, you're always many. And that many is not just the living, the dead as well, and also the unborn. And once you conceive of yourself in this way, once you can imagine that this is truly how you exist, the world is a much less lonely place. And it gives you a proportion to your own activities, and it renders a lot of the absurdities of this life as just sort of pointless vanities that you don't have to worry so much about. So I found this idea that seemed at once so simple, endlessly rich, and I tried to write this book, which was really written from the novelistic part of me, in that it asks questions, it doesn't propose answers. And I guess the mechanism it uses for that is this idea of recursive time.
And that brings us to Chekhov and question 7 and the title of the book. Tell us about question 7. What is the question?
Oh, well, question 7 comes from a very early sketch, as they were called, that Chekhov wrote when he was a poor student trying to support his studies and his family by writing short comic pieces for Russian newspapers. And the sketch has got a name like Questions Posed by a Mad Mathematician, and they're of that type of mental arithmetic test you used to get given in primary schools. I don't know if they still do that, but the question 7 in this sketch is April 1881. A train leaves station A at 3 a.m. and is to arrive at station B at 11 p.m. Who loves longer, a man or a woman? That's question 7. It's really just an absurd joke. And yet within it, you have captured the entire genius of Chekhov, which is that his stories always propose a surface world, a world in which, we live by timetables and duties and responsibilities. But underneath it, we're haunted by these questions like who loves longer? What is it to live? How do we find meaning? And that's why there's always something at once very concrete and very haunted, I think, about Chekhov's stories. I thought it was an apt title for the novel in consequence.
Well, of course, literature looms largely the whole way through the book, but you too became very aware that you wanted to be a writer at the age of 4. How was that?
Oh, well, that's just an embarrassment, Georgina. Really. I got asked that question once. When did you know you want to be a writer? And it was before I could write, and I don't know why I wanted to be a writer. I mean, there were no examples of it in my world, art and writing, these were things that people did in faraway countries, like places that were just mythical and mystical to us, like Europe or Britain or America. And, we were a people brought up to dig holes and chop things down. That was the extent, of what you might do. My mother was an ambitious woman. She hoped I might make a good plumber. It was that sort of world. And so I guess, though, when I look back on it, books were revered. I think there was something of that Irish sensibility that the written word counted for something. And those who practiced it, that had the aspect of a vocation about it. And I think above all, perhaps it was because my grandparents were illiterate and my father was the only one of his family to get beyond a handful of years of schooling and get to high school, he had learnt that not having the written word was an oppression, that it was a lack of freedom, and that equally having the ability to summon the universe through these abstract 26 symbols was an extraordinary power that was a form of magic. And I think he imparted to me that sense of the magical power of words. And I think that idea of the magic of words, because there is something magical and alchemical about words, because they not only can recreate worlds, they can create entire new universes just through these 26 abstract symbols and the patterns you might make out of them. And there is something about that which I think we all take too much for granted once we have a couple of generations of literacy surrounding us in our families. But my father once said to me that the written word was he grew up in a very poor hamlet. His father was a railway fettler in the bush, and he said the written word was the first beautiful thing he ever encountered, a line which I shamelessly stole and put in one of my novels. But I was always very moved by it.
He had so much privation in his life. You talk about your ancestors not being discussed, the convict past, the mixed race element of it, but also you felt that you were brought up in an atmosphere of secrecy because of what had happened to your father in Japan.
My parents came from an impoverished world and a world of privations. That's nothing uncommon to the mass of humanity, or even the mass of English people at that time, or the mass of Australian people at that time. It was a normal thing. The silence about the convict past and the genocide, that was a different order of trauma, I think. I think when you visit these vast traumas on a society, they don't stop with the people who are flogged or hung or shot or murdered or whatever. They don't stop there. These crimes pass out into friends, families, communities, societies. I think they do get passed on. And at some point, I think man survives too by his ability to forget. It's a necessary thing at a certain time, but equally freedom exists in the space of memory. And at a certain point, if you are to be truly free, you have to walk back into that darkness if you're ever to be able to come back and confront it, if you're ever able to come back out and dance in the light. So sometimes that's given to an individual in their life. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes these things are incommunicable for many. And sometimes it falls to others, their descendants or to historians. And sometimes it falls to artists or writers. But, and I guess I grew up in a society, and as a writer you have what you're given. And I realised these were subjects that I couldn't really escape if I was to write truthfully. My father's experience in Japan, on the death railway in Thailand and then as a slave labourer in Japan, he was fortunate to have a very long life. He died at 98, and he was fortunate to have the time to be able to reflect on these and think deeply about them and distill them into some meaning that he could find hope and goodness in. I think in the end he distilled that whole extraordinary and terrible experience into a sort of into an idea of love. But that's what he found in that experience. And I realised as he grew older that memory is many things. And I think ever since World War II, we've seen memory very much as an act of testimony, and it is and must be. But it is also an act of creation. And it can be an act of creation for the worst, and we can create dangerous myths of victimhood and so on. Or it can be an act of creation for the better, where we find things that join us, not just with those who've suffered, but those who've inflicted the suffering.
You write in the book that the most important thing to your father was kindness and courage. I want to talk now about really a defining aspect of your life, which was a very courageous incident. This is your death experience that happened on the Franklin River. But in fact, you've written about this before. Back in 1994, your first novel was Death of a River Guide. Was that you attempting to make sense of this huge incident that happened in your life? I don't want to go into it in detail because it is one of the most brilliant pieces of writing I've ever been fortunate enough to read. It comes towards the end of the book. But as I say, you have written about it before.
I did in my first novel, but as I say in question 7, I felt I dealt with it inadequately because I thought it was in the past. And I also thought that by writing about it, that would help keep it in the past and cordon it off from my consciousness. And what I came to realise over years and then decades is that it wasn't in the past and it would never be in the past. And that when I went to that terrible place, it wasn't just that it was still there, it was still happening. And that my terror will be until the end, that I'm still there, there in the River Dark, and that everything that has happened has just been a dream, and that my real life and death were those hours. And that's where I'll return. So it took me, my life to understand that, I guess. It's not that I wrote the novel with a false premise, but I wrote it with a wishful misunderstanding of what had happened to me, I guess. I should say too, it wasn't there was no courage there. It was a misadventure, and I was, I was lucky to be talking. Well, I'm lucky to be talking to you now, and that's really it. But I guess after it gives you a different measure by which you see the world, and a lot of things that are presented as large and of consequence come to seem small and trivial. And more and more I saw that my parents, who both faced up because of their backgrounds they were realists. They understood that we live in a meaningless universe, and that their answer to that was an idea of love, which came through in just their acts of kindness and goodness to others, in their jokes and their stories, their compassion. When I was young, I thought this was a little naive, but they fought for that love and they practiced that love, and they refused ever to surrender that love. And over the decades, that love became their hard-won reality. I saw that too was a form of magic, and they the magician, and rather than it being naive, that the naivety had been mine alone. So I guess that was the gift of that experience to me. And, we live in a world where everything's political, but the truth is most things are not political. The machinations of power affect us, and we should be concerned by them. But they are like a sewerage pipe. We shouldn't need to have to put our heads in it every day and think that it's the measure of all things. There is, a vast span of extraordinary things that make us human, and they cannot be reduced to politics or ideology. And that's why they're strange, often difficult, but also large and extraordinary. And it's those things I wanted to celebrate in this book, because above all, I wanted it to be a book of hope, because I think the question that certainly consumed me, but I think affected many people towards the end of that strange autumn that was the COVID years, was the question of how to live. What is it to live? Why do we live? And you can see that in everything from the lie flat movement in China to the Great Resignation in the West. I guess that's the real question that the book, it doesn't make an answer to it, but it constantly looks at it from different angles.
And is circular, as you say. And from that circular aspect, we get to chain reaction. And of course, the other sort of narrative that is woven through the book, that of H.G. Wells, Rebecca West, and then coming on to the atomic bombs that were dropped in Japan. It's extraordinary the way you put these together, and it works absolutely. I wonder if you could just tell me about your first readings of H.G. Wells and realising that, in fact, he had been writing about what was going on in Tasmania.
Well, yeah, I mean, like so many people, because H.G. Wells is really such a foundational writer for so much of not just 20th century and 21st century literature, but of modern culture, you know, and his influence is so ubiquitous that we don't really see it, but we absorb it. And so I thought I knew the story of War of the Worlds. But it wasn't until I read it, I don't know, 20, 25 years ago, that I was shocked to discover in the preface that what had inspired him was the genocide of the Tasmanian Aborigines. And he simply reimagined that, the English invasion of Van Diemen's Land, as Tasmania was then called, as a Martian invasion of Surrey. And you suddenly see that what's too easily is, you know, these days represented as an Edwardian novelty was in fact an extraordinary indictment of English imperialism. And so I grew interested in Wells, and at the same time, I've always, well, certainly as long as I can remember, I've been conscious that if the atomic bomb hadn't been dropped on Hiroshima and that terrible crime had not happened, my father, who was in working as a slave labourer in an undersea coal mine on the inland sea about 80 miles south of Hiroshima, would have perished. He was near his end, and if the war had dragged on until the winter, which was the plan of the Americans, they were set to invade in November, he would have either perished of malnutrition and illness, or he would have been mass murdered, as was the Japanese plan with the prisoners of war that were on the Japanese islands. And so because of the bomb, my father lived and I was born, and that my book's written, and in consequence I'm talking to you now, and whoever's listening is listening. So it's a very strange thing to be aware of. And so I over the years I read about the bomb, and there's many very good histories of it, but they tend to present it as a history of scientific discoveries that culminate in the Manhattan Project and that extraordinary national effort by the Americans that leads to the bomb being dropped in August 1945, first on Hiroshima and then a few days later a second bomb on Nagasaki. But there is another history I discovered, which is in 1911, H.G. Wells invited to his house a young woman journalist who was to become one of the leading writers of the 20th century, Rebecca West. And in his library, they kissed. And she was 18 and he was, I think, 42. And although a proponent of free love, it was a free love with certain limits. And Rebecca West was for a love without limits. And this idea of a limitless love, I think, terrified Wells, who promptly ran off to Switzerland and cut off all contact with Rebecca West, and there wrote a book in which she invents the ultimate weapon of mass destruction, which is founded in the latest scientific discoveries. Wells was well versed in science, and he called this weapon the atomic bomb. And he describes in considerable detail the consequences of a bomb the size of a pineapple that could blow up cities, on the politics of the world and on the future of humanity itself. And this was regarded quite rightly as a pretty bad book. I think the Times Literary Supplement described it as reading it as like walking through porridge. But it had an impact with some people. Winston Churchill was one. And in the early 1930s, it was read by a young Jewish refugee scientist who had fled Hitler's Germany by the name of Leo Szilard. And at the traffic lights at Southampton Road, after having read the book, he looked up at the lights and he was suddenly possessed of a vision that for a moment he couldn't put words to. But when he did, it was the theory of nuclear fission and of the nuclear chain reaction, which is the basis from which the bomb was developed. And Szilard was inspired by that, by Wells, by a novel. And he became so terrified because he realised that Wells was right, that within the discoveries about radium and so on that Rutherford had pioneered in the Edwardian era and on which Wells had drawn for his book was the possibility of the obliteration of humanity. And he was terrified Hitler would get it. And so he eventually lobbied Einstein to send a letter which he'd written to Roosevelt arguing for massive research program by the American government into developing an atomic bomb in order to beat the Germans, the Nazis, to it. And that led to the Manhattan Project, which ultimately, of course, leads to Hiroshima. Mm. And so my story, once I thought about this, I realised my whole story is really a nuclear chain reaction that begins with a kiss in front of a bookcase in London in 1911 and finishes with my story and the stories out of which I've been created, the stories of genocide and slavery on one side and of kindness and goodness and love on the other. And I used this idea of the nuclear chain reaction, of a daisy chain of events, to structure all these disparate thoughts and to give them form, because a book without form and structure is like a jellyfish pretending to be a white pointer. And once I had that idea of the chain reaction of events, I was able to bring all these ideas and thoughts that had haunted me for so long into some meaningful relationship with each other. And then my challenge was simply to write it as lightly as possible. So as I wrote each part of the book, I would try and pull out every sentence, every paragraph, every adverb, every adjective that it didn't need, so that it everything had a lightness. And that was to mirror this idea of hope. And that, I guess, is the way I wrote this book. And in one sense, it was a lifetime in its creation. In another, it was about 11 months in the writing.
It's the most extraordinary achievement, and it's been rightly recognised by the judges of the Baillie Gifford Prize, but it's a prize that you have decided not to take at the moment. You gave a very gracious speech, and I wondered if you could just talk us through what the prize means to you and why you've said what you've said about it.
Well, I was enormously honoured to receive the prize because, it is the preeminent non-fiction prize, and I was simply honoured to be on the shortlist. Not all prizes do feel such an honour, but that did. It was a very distinguished shortlist. So I wish to accept the prize, and I admire, in an environment, particularly in Britain at the moment, where things are so difficult for writers, where there are so few supports for a culture of writing. I admired Baillie Gifford for, putting their money over to support things like the Baillie Gifford Prize. And so it was important to me to show considerable respect and honour Baillie Gifford for all that they do. At the same time, there has been this controversy about their 1% investment, which is a minimal investment, but nevertheless a real investment in fossil fuels. And I just think there come moments in your life where you face a choice. And anguished about this. I could have taken the money and given it away, for example, but I think that's a terrible precedent in that writers need money. The prizes exist to give them money. And I felt if I did that, it just created an unfair precedent and an unfair idea with the public that the money doesn't matter. Well, the money does matter. Nevertheless, I delayed my acceptance of it until, made it contingent, speaking with Baillie Gifford and them sharing with the public a plan for reducing their investments in fossil fuels and increasing their investments in renewables. Now, whether they do that or not remains to be seen, but I was heartened by a phone call I had within a few hours of receiving the news that I'd won it from a senior partner in Baillie Gifford, in which he very graciously congratulated me, and at which we talked at length and at ease about many things, and in which he invited me to Edinburgh to speak with his partners about the terrible impact that fossil fuel-induced climate change is having on my island world, its forests, its seas, and on the very lives of people here. And so I see that as a beginning, and I hope and will do all I can to continue in a spirit of good faith, and which I believe Baillie Gifford are acting in also, to ensure that that's not the end of the story.
Richard Flanagan, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Georgina.
Question 7. The winner of the 2024 Baillie Gifford Prize is published by Chatto and Windus, and it's out now. You've been listening to Meet the Writers. Thanks to the producer Steph Chungu, who also edits the show, and many thanks also to the Baillie Gifford Prize for non-fiction. You can download this show and previous episodes from our website or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thank you for listening.